Ethan Voss scowled as the cool metal of the examination table pressed against his bare back. He didn't trust alien doctors. Scratch that, he didn't trust aliens, period. But his options were limited after barely escaping that last ambush with his life. His ribs ached, his head throbbed, and if the eerie blue-skinned nurse hovering over him didn't stop poking at his side, he was going to lose his patience. "You flinch like a hatchling," she observed, voice calm, clinical. "Hold still." Ethan gritted his teeth. "I'd hold still if you stopped jabbing me like a damn science project." The nurse, Veyna, she'd introduced herself, tilted her head, her luminous silver eyes assessing him with detached amusement. She was gorgeous in a way that annoyed him. Sharp features, full lips, long violet black hair pulled into a sleek knot. The kind of beauty that made men stupid, which was the last thing he needed. She ran a scanning device along his torso, its hum filling the sterile room. "I assure you, I am treating you as I would any other patient." "Yeah, pretty hands-on for just a scan." Her gaze flicked to him. "Is that discomfort, or are humans just this dramatic?" Ethan scoffed, but before he could snap back, her fingers pressed against a scar near his ribs. A routine touch until Veyna froze. Her breath hitched. Her pupils constricted as her hand jerked back slightly, then hesitated. Ethan tensed. "What?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached forward again, deliberately this time, pressing the same spot. A jolt shot through his nerves, not pain but something else. The sensation was sharp, unfamiliar, almost like a static charge racing beneath his skin. Her eyes widened. "That's unusual." Ethan sat up fast, ignoring the fresh stab of pain. "Define unusual." Veyna didn't answer right away. Instead, she grabbed a medical scanner, waving it over his torso. Her expression darkened as alien symbols flickered across the screen. "Your body just produced an energy signature I have never seen in a human before." Ethan frowned. "That's news to me." Her gaze snapped to his, suspicion creeping into her voice. "You weren't aware?" "Would I be sitting here like an idiot if I was?" She studied him for a long moment, then muttered something in her own language before running another scan. "I need to examine this more thoroughly." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You mean poke at me until you figure out why I glow in the dark?" Veyna arched a brow. "If that were the case, I'd turn off the lights and confirm my hypothesis." Despite himself, Ethan let out a rough chuckle. "Great, alien nurse with a sense of humor. That's new." She ignored him, pressing her fingers to the spot again, this time applying deliberate pressure. The sensation intensified, still not painful but more intrusive. Something inside him reacted to her touch, like a hidden circuit springing to life. Veyna inhaled sharply. "Fascinating." Ethan gripped her wrist before she could press further. "You want to start explaining what the hell is going on?" Her gaze flicked to where his fingers wrapped around her wrist. Her skin was warm, soft. "Damn it, focus." "This isn't a normal injury," she said, ignoring his grip. "There is something embedded inside you, something foreign." His gut twisted. "What kind of something?" She pulled away from his grip, grabbing a nearby console. "It appears to be an implant, one not of human origin." Ethan went rigid. "Implant?" His voice dropped. "Like a tracker?" Veyna's brow furrowed. "Possibly, but it's inactive, or rather, it was inactive until I touched it." His jaw clenched. He had plenty of scars, but none he couldn't explain. The thought that someone had implanted something in him without his knowledge made his skin crawl. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "So what? You just flipped a switch. What happens now?" Veyna hesitated. "I don't know." "Comforting," he muttered. She pursed her lips. "I need to run deeper scans." Ethan shook his head. "No way, I don't trust alien tech." "Then trust me," she said, matter of fact. He let out a dry laugh. "Trust you. We just met." Veyna met his gaze evenly. "And yet, I am the only one here trying to help you." That shut him up. With a reluctant sigh, Ethan leaned back against the table. "Fine. But if you're planning to dissect me, at least buy me dinner first." Veyna's lips quirked. "I assure you, you are not that interesting." Ethan smirked, but beneath his usual sarcasm, unease gnawed at him. What the hell was inside him? And why did he have the nagging feeling that this was only the beginning? Ethan exhaled slowly, watching Veyna work. Her fingers moved swiftly over the console, eyes darting between the alien glyphs flashing across the screen. The air in the sterile medbay felt heavier now, thick with unspoken tension. "So, what's the verdict?" he asked, arms crossed over his chest. "Did the little alien surprise in my ribs just start broadcasting my location to something nasty?" Veyna didn't look up. "If it did, I would have detected an outgoing signal." "Not exactly reassuring," Ethan muttered. She pressed a few buttons, then turned back to him, expression unreadable. "It's dormant again. Whatever happened when I touched it was temporary," he frowned. "That doesn't make sense. If it was some kind of implant, wouldn't it have activated before? I've taken hits right on that spot before. Nothing." Veyna tilted her head, studying him with that unsettling, analytical gaze. "Which means external force alone is not the trigger." Ethan raised a brow. "And you touching it is." She hesitated. "It appears so." A chill ran down his spine. That wasn't exactly comforting. He'd had a lot of things embedded in his body over the years. Shrapnel, bullet fragments, one particularly nasty spike of bone from an insectoid raider, but never something responsive. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "All right, say you're right. Say this thing inside me is only reacting to you." "Why?" Veyna remained silent for a moment too long. Then carefully, she placed a hand just above the spot, hovering inches from his skin. Ethan barely resisted the urge to flinch. The last thing he needed was more weirdness. Her brows furrowed in concentration. "There's an energy signature, faint but present." "Yeah, you mentioned that," he said dryly. "Mind explaining what it means?" She withdrew her hand, stepping back slightly. "Human physiology doesn't naturally produce energy fields like this. Not without augmentation. Yet this reaction isn't mechanical, it's biological." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Are you saying this thing is alive?" "No," she paused. "At least not in the way you're thinking. It's more like an extension of something. A receiver, perhaps. It reacts to my presence, which suggests it was designed with certain parameters in mind." His patience was wearing thin. "In plain words, Doc," Veyna let out a slow breath. "Someone put this in you, Ethan, and whoever they were, they wanted it to respond to my species." His blood ran cold. "Son of a..." He pushed off the table, pacing the length of the small room. "I don't even know your species. Never met one of you before today. You're telling me someone stuck an alien receiver in my ribs years ago and I'm just now finding out?" Veyna folded her arms. "The implant was likely dormant until now, but the fact that it reacted so strongly to me suggests its design was intentional." He shot her a look. "Which means either someone wanted me dead the second I ran into one of your kind, or this is part of something bigger." She nodded once. "I would agree with that assessment. Fantastic, just what he needed. Another mystery tied to some part of his body he didn't understand." He pinched the bridge of his nose. "All right, fine. How do we get it out?" For the first time she looked almost hesitant. "That may not be the best course of action." Ethan froze. "Come again." Veyna pursed her lips. "It's embedded deep within your tissue. Extracting it without knowing more could cause severe damage. Additionally, we don't yet know what function it serves." He let out a humorless laugh. "So let me get this straight. I've got an alien implant in my body that lights up when you touch it. No one knows what it does, and I can't remove it." She inclined her head. "That is the situation, yes." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. "Great, just great." Silence stretched between them. Veyna watched him carefully, her gaze calculating but not unkind. He didn't trust her, at least not yet, but she was the only one giving him answers. After a long pause, she spoke again. "I need to study this further." Ethan smirked despite himself. "Let me guess. That's your polite way of saying I need to stay here while you poke at me some more. Her lips twitched. It would be wise. If this implant is connected to something larger, you may be in danger. Not exactly a new experience for me. She studied him for a beat longer, then finally nodded. Regardless, you are my patient now, Ethan Voss, and I intend to figure this out. He met her gaze, and for the first time there was something almost warm in it. Ethan sighed, leaning back against the table with a tired grin. Lucky me. Ethan sat on the edge of the medical table, his boots tapping a steady rhythm against the metal floor. He wasn't one for waiting, and being a test subject in an alien's lab, again, wasn't sitting well with him. Across from him, Veyna adjusted the settings on a handheld scanner, her expression cool and unreadable. The device hummed softly in her grip, casting a faint blue light over her slender fingers. You look way too comfortable doing this, Ethan muttered. Veyna didn't look up. I am comfortable. I've spent years studying anatomy, both human and otherwise. That's supposed to make me feel better. She lifted an elegant brow. Would you prefer a nervous doctor? Ethan smirked. I'd prefer no doctor. No offense. Offense noted, she replied dryly, stepping closer. Hold still. He tensed as she ran the scanner over his torso, lingering just above the spot where the implant rested beneath his skin. A faint warmth followed in its wake, like static electricity building up just beneath the surface. Ethan gritted his teeth. Feels weird. That's because it's responding again, she murmured. He cursed under his breath. I don't like that it has moods. Veyna's brow furrowed as she studied the scanner's readout. It's not sentient, but it does appear to react to external stimuli. Ethan exhaled sharply. Like you. She didn't deny it. Instead, she turned the device so he could see the readings. On the display, a glowing symbol pulsed in time with his heartbeat, alien, intricate, and unmistakably deliberate. Ethan narrowed his eyes. That's not normal. No, she agreed. It's a beacon. He stilled. A what? Veyna's expression darkened. A signal marker. I don't think this is a tracking device in the traditional sense, but someone somewhere will recognize that frequency. Ethan swore. Meaning the second we figure out how it works, we might be tipping off the wrong people, correct? He ran a hand through his hair. Perfect. Just what I needed, mystery enemies. Veyna hesitated, then shut off the scanner. I may have a way to suppress it. Ethan scoffed. Why do I feel like the next thing you say is going to be something I really don't want to hear? She stepped closer, her voice softer now. I told you it reacts to me. If that reaction is what activates the beacon, then it stands to reason that I could disrupt it. He tensed. How? Her gaze didn't waver. Physical contact. Ethan blinked. Come again. Veyna's lips pressed into a thin line. The implant doesn't just react to my presence. It reacts to my touch. When I first examined it, it flared to life. But when I withdrew, it went dormant again. He arched a brow. So what? You're saying if we just stay in contact, it won't activate, she nodded. It's a theory. Ethan let out a dry laugh. Hell of a theory. Veyna exhaled as if summoning patience. This is the most immediate solution we have. Until I can isolate the beacon's function and determine how to disable it permanently, we may need to take unconventional measures. He gave her a slow, measured look. You realize how ridiculous this sounds, right? She crossed her arms. I am aware. Ethan rubbed his temples. You want to be glued to me until you fix this. Not glued, she corrected, but extended proximity may be necessary. He barked out a laugh. And here I thought alien medicine was all advanced and sophisticated. Turns out the solution to my mystery implant is hand-holding. Veyna did not look amused. You're enjoying this. Little bit, he admitted. She stepped even closer, looking up at him with an expression that was entirely too serious. If we do not suppress this, it could lead to worse consequences. I am not suggesting this lightly. Ethan sighed, rolling his shoulders. All right, I get it. But if you're going to be attached to my side for the foreseeable future, you better not be one of those doctors who lectures their patients about diet. Veyna's lips quirked slightly. I make no promises. Ethan chuckled despite himself. Great, just great. Veyna reached out, resting her hand lightly against his side, just over the implant. A faint pulse of warmth radiated through his skin, subtle but noticeable. Ethan swallowed. This was going to be interesting. Ethan stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched as he tried to ignore the warmth of Veyna's palm against his side. She stood close, too close, her fingers pressing lightly over the implant embedded beneath his skin. The steady, rhythmic pulsing had dimmed the moment she made contact, confirming her theory. Well, he muttered, looks like you were right. Veyna's gaze flicked to the scanner in her other hand, studying the data. For now. The signal has weakened, but I will need to monitor it to ensure it remains suppressed. Ethan exhaled sharply. So what? This is my life now, stuck in some weird sci-fi version of a three-legged race with my alien doctor. Veyna did not react to his sarcasm. Would you prefer the alternative? Ethan grimaced. Point taken. Her touch remained clinical, but there was no ignoring the strange undercurrent that passed between them. She was a scientist first, a healer, an expert in alien physiology. But she was also someone who had never been this close to a human for this long. Ethan glanced down at her. She was focused, sharp-eyed, her expression unreadable. He didn't know much about her species beyond their reputation, cold, logical, distant, but Veyna didn't quite fit that mold. She wanted to understand. Does this feel weird to you? He asked. She blinked. Define weird. Ethan smirked. You examining me like this, up close, hands-on. Veyna was silent for a moment before responding. Physical contact is not a necessity in my profession. We prioritize efficiency over familiarity. Ethan tilted his head. So you don't touch people? Not unless required. Huh, he studied her. And you don't feel anything when you do. Veyna's fingers twitched, barely perceptible, but Ethan caught it. I am trained to remain impartial. That's not an answer, he pointed out, her jaw tightened slightly. It is the one I am providing. Ethan chuckled. You're really not used to this, are you? She gave him a measured look. I have studied human interactions extensively. Studying and experiencing are two different things. Veyna hesitated. I am aware. The silence stretched between them, charged with something unspoken. Ethan could feel the faint warmth of her touch even through the fabric of his shirt, the weight of her presence oddly grounding. So, he said after a beat, how long do we have to keep this up? I will need more data to determine that, she admitted. For now, it is best we remain within close proximity to monitor fluctuations. Ethan groaned. Fantastic. He shifted slightly, testing the movement. Veyna's hand followed, adjusting automatically to maintain contact. He snorted. You're really committed to this. I do not take my work lightly. Yeah, I'm getting that. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, Doc. Guess you and I are stuck together for the foreseeable future. Hope you're ready to get very familiar with human personal space. Veyna arched a brow. I am adaptable, he smirked. We'll see about that. As if to test her, he shifted again, turning his torso slightly. Veyna adjusted instantly, her fingers trailing over his ribs as she maintained contact. It was efficient, precise. But there was no denying the unintentional intimacy of it. Ethan swallowed, suddenly aware of how close they were. The air between them felt thinner somehow, more charged. He expected Veyna to pull away to reset the boundaries, but she didn't. Instead, she looked up at him, studying his expression. And then, to his utter surprise, she spoke softly. You are warmer than I expected. Ethan blinked. Thanks. She tilted her head slightly as if analyzing the statement. It is merely an observation. Yeah, well, I don't think I've ever been called warm before, not like that. Veyna's fingers flexed against his side, the smallest shift of pressure. Is that a bad thing? Ethan exhaled slowly. No. Just new. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The ship's engines hummed softly in the background, a steady reminder of the world outside this strange, unexpected moment. Then Veyna did something unexpected. She trailed her fingertips slightly, just a fraction of an inch over the implant's site. Whether intentional or reflexive, Ethan didn't know. But the reaction was immediate. A sharp pulse shot through the implant, an electric jolt that made Ethan inhale sharply. His muscles tensed, a shiver rolling down his spine. Veyna's eyes widened. "What?" Ethan started, but she cut him off. "I did not anticipate that," he huffed. "No kidding." Her fingers hovered as if debating whether to pull away or press down again. But it was her expression that caught Ethan's attention. She wasn't just confused, she was intrigued. "What did you feel?" he asked. Veyna hesitated. "Something reactive. It was not entirely mechanical." Ethan frowned. "Meaning," she met his gaze, "it responded to more than just contact." "It responded to me." His pulse quickened. "What the hell does that mean?" Veyna's lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer right away. Her fingers still lingered against his skin, the warmth of her touch contrasting with the lingering sensation of the implant's pulse. "I am not certain," she admitted at last. Ethan exhaled, his heartbeat unsteady. "Yeah, well, you and me both." Ethan wasn't sure how long they stood there, his mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. The implant had reacted to her, not just to touch but her specifically. That wasn't normal. That wasn't something he could just ignore. Veyna was still staring at him, her fingers unmoving now, but her expression was anything but neutral. Her mind was working through possibilities, analyzing, calculating. He could almost see the gears turning behind those piercing violet eyes. Ethan swallowed. "So, what now?" Veyna blinked as if snapping back to the present. "We must conduct further tests." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, figures." He shifted slightly. "You planning on poking at my ribs all night, or—" Veyna retracted her hand smoothly, but not before Ethan noticed something. She was reluctant. It wasn't obvious, not in any way she would admit, but he felt it in the slight hesitation, the fraction of a second too long that her fingers lingered before pulling away. "We should return to the medical bay," she said, stepping back. "I need to recalibrate the scanners and compare this data to previous readings." Ethan took a breath, grounding himself. The lingering sensation of her touch still prickled at his skin. "Fine, but I'm gonna need a drink after this." Veyna gave him a sidelong glance as they started toward the corridor. "Alcohol could interfere with your physiology during examination." Ethan smirked. "I said I needed one, not that I was gonna get one." She didn't respond, but he swore he saw the slightest flicker of amusement in her eyes before she turned away. They walked in silence, the ship's soft hum filling the quiet space between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. Something had shifted. Something neither of them had been prepared for. By the time they reached the medical bay, Ethan had decided he wasn't going to be the one to bring it up first. If Veyna wanted to pretend like that moment, whatever the hell it was, didn't happen, that was fine by him. Except she didn't. Instead of retreating into her usual detached professionalism, she hesitated before reaching for the console. She glanced at him, and for the first time since they'd met, she looked uncertain. "I must ask you something," she said. Ethan leaned against the nearest counter, arms crossed. "Go for it." Veyna hesitated again, definitely not like her. "Did you feel it?" Ethan arched a brow. "You mean the weird shock thing?" "Yeah, pretty hard to miss." "No," she said, her voice quieter now. "Before that." Ethan's stomach dipped. His first instinct was to deflect, to throw out some sarcastic remark, but something in her expression made him stop. He swallowed. "Yeah, I did." Veyna studied him, her gaze sharp and searching, like she was peeling back layers, analyzing something she couldn't quite define. "That is unexpected," she finally said. Ethan huffed. "Tell me about it." She exhaled through her nose, the closest thing to a sigh she ever allowed herself. This is not the outcome I anticipated. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Same here, Doc. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt different now, not just charged, but heavy. Like they were standing on the edge of something neither of them knew how to navigate. Veyna finally turned back to the console, fingers moving over the controls with practiced precision. I need to analyze the implant's response. If this reaction is unique to me, we must determine why. Ethan nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, right, science first. But the problem was, for the first time since he'd been dragged into this mess, he wasn't sure science was the answer. Ethan sat on the examination table as Veyna recalibrated the scanner, her movements precise, but lacking their usual mechanical detachment. She was focused, too focused. It was the kind of concentration someone used when they were avoiding something. The silence stretched, thick and unspoken. The implant in his chest still tingled faintly, like a fading echo of whatever had just happened between them. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "All right, Doc," he finally said. "We both know this isn't just about the implant." Veyna didn't look up from her screen. "That is an assumption, not a certainty." Ethan snorted. "Yeah, then why do you look like you just saw a ghost?" Her fingers hesitated over the controls just for a second. If he hadn't been watching, he would have missed it. Ethan pushed. "Something happened when you touched me." "It wasn't just a reaction from the implant, it was you." Veyna straightened, her posture perfectly rigid. "That is precisely what I intend to determine." Ethan shook his head. "No, I mean you felt it too, didn't you?" For the first time since he'd met her, Veyna looked uncomfortable. It was subtle, just a flicker of tension at the corner of her mouth, the faintest tightening of her grip on the console's edge. "I am not the subject of this examination," she said, voice carefully neutral. Ethan let out a slow, dry laugh. "Oh, come on, you're really gonna pretend that was nothing?" He gestured between them. "I've been poked, prodded, and scanned since the second I got on this ship, and nothing like that has ever happened before." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "So either you explain what's going on, or I start making my own guesses." Veyna was silent for a long moment, as if weighing her options. Then finally she exhaled. "I do not have an explanation," she admitted. Ethan arched a brow. "That's a first." She shot him a sharp look, but there was no real bite behind it. Instead, her expression shifted into something else, something more thoughtful, almost uncertain. "I have encountered countless physiological reactions," she said, as if working through the logic out loud. "I have observed neural responses, hormonal fluctuations, even subconscious physiological triggers. But this," she hesitated, glancing at him. "I felt it, yes, but I do not know why." Ethan watched her carefully. "And that bothers you." Veyna's jaw tensed. "Uncertainty is inefficient." Ethan smirked. "You're dodging the question again." She gave him an unimpressed look but didn't refute it. Instead, she finally turned away from the console and stepped closer, her gaze scrutinizing. "If the implant reacted to my presence specifically, then there must be a biological component involved." Ethan met her gaze steadily. "Or maybe it's not just biological." Something flickered in her expression. "Not doubt, no, Veyna didn't do doubt, but something close." "Explain," she said. Ethan shrugged, though his chest felt a little too tight. "I don't know, Doc. Maybe this is more than just some freak reaction. Maybe it's, I don't know, connection or something." Veyna blinked. "That is not a scientific explanation." Ethan smirked. "No, but it's an honest one." She studied him, her gaze sharp and unyielding, but there was something different behind it now. Something that made Ethan's stomach do an uncomfortable flip. "You believe this is personal," she said. Ethan swallowed. "I think we'd be idiots to pretend it isn't." Silence. Heavy, thick, pressing. Then, Veyna took another step forward, closer than she needed to be. "Then we must determine," she murmured, "exactly what this connection means." Ethan barely had time to register the meaning of her words before she reached out and touched him again. The moment Veyna's fingers pressed against his chest, the reaction was immediate. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath as the implant flared to life beneath her touch. But it wasn't just the usual pulse of energy or static discharge. This was different, deeper. The sensation spread through his body like a wave, not painful but intense, as if something inside him was resonating, aligning with her presence. And then Veyna gasped. Her eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, Ethan saw something unguarded flash across her face. Surprise. Awe. And beneath it all, recognition. She staggered back a step, pulling her hand away like she'd just touched something forbidden. Her breathing was slightly uneven, a rare crack in her normally controlled demeanor. Ethan stared at her. Okay, that wasn't normal. Veyna's lips parted as if she was about to speak, but no words came. She looked down at her own hand, flexing her fingers like she was testing if they still obeyed her. Ethan swung his legs over the edge of the exam table, rubbing his chest where the tingling still lingered. You felt that, didn't you? Veyna finally looked at him. Yes, Ethan let out a slow exhale. What the hell was that? She shook her head slightly as if trying to clear it. I do not know, Ethan frowned. No theories, not even a bad one, Veyna hesitated. There is one possibility. Ethan sat up straighter. I'm listening. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she turned back to the scanner and pulled up the data, her eyes scanning the results with a level of focus that made Ethan uneasy. I need to confirm before I speculate, she murmured. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Veyna. She stopped typing. He sighed. Look, I get that you like having answers before you open your mouth, but you just reacted to something that wasn't supposed to happen. I deserve to know why. She held his gaze for a long moment then, against all odds, relented. There are records, she said carefully, of certain biological phenomena among my species, rare occurrences, theoretical in most cases. Ethan's stomach twisted. Go on. Veyna inhaled slowly. A bond. Ethan blinked. A what? She looked at him fully now, her expression unreadable. A neural and biochemical link between two individuals. It is believed to be instinctual, evolutionary, a connection so profound that it defies standard biological interactions. Ethan swallowed hard. And you're saying that's what just happened? Veyna exhaled. I am saying it is the closest approximation I can provide at this moment. Ethan ran a hand down his face. So what? I'm bonded to you now. That's a thing. Veyna's jaw tightened. I do not know if it is mutual. Something about the way she said it made Ethan pause. He studied her face, the tension in her posture, the uncertainty buried beneath her usual logic-driven mask. But you felt it, he said. Which means, at the very least, something's happening. Veyna glanced away but didn't deny it. Ethan let out a rough laugh. So just to recap, your fancy medical exam just told us we might be what? Fated. Veyna's brows pulled together slightly. Fate is an unscientific concept. Ethan shook his head, chuckling despite himself. Yeah, well, so is whatever just happened. She looked back at him, her expression unreadable. But there was something else now, something beneath all that clinical detachment, something that made Ethan's chest tighten. He cleared his throat. So what do we do now? Veyna hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. We proceed with caution. Ethan arched a brow. That's your big plan. She stepped closer, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. For now, yes. Ethan stared at her, his pulse still not quite steady. Yeah, he muttered. All right. Caution, sure. But something told him neither of them had a damn clue what they were walking into. Ethan sat on the edge of the examination table, running a hand through his hair as the weight of Veyna's words settled over him. A bond. He wasn't sure what to make of it. Hell, he wasn't even sure if he believed it, but the way she had reacted, that wasn't something she could fake. Veyna wasn't the type to get rattled, and yet she had been. Across the room, she was methodically running diagnostics, her movements as precise as ever, but Ethan could see the slight stiffness in her shoulders. She was thinking, probably trying to logic her way through something that didn't fit neatly into her world of numbers and analysis. "So this bond thing," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "How does it work?" Veyna didn't turn around. "There is little empirical data, most accounts are anecdotal and none have been thoroughly studied." Ethan exhaled. "Great, so we're flying blind." She hesitated, then finally turned to face him. "If this is a bond, there may be effects." Ethan frowned. "What kind of effects?" Veyna's gaze flickered, and for the first time since meeting her, she looked almost uneasy. Emotional synchronization, heightened awareness of the other. A potential pull toward proximity. Ethan stared at her. "Are you saying I'm gonna start feeling what you feel?" She pressed her lips together, as if debating how much to say. "It is possible." Ethan let out a short laugh, running a hand over his face. "This just keeps getting better." Veyna watched him carefully. It would be prudent to monitor any changes in behavior or sensation, if this is temporary. "But what if it's not?" Ethan interrupted silence. That was answer enough. Ethan blew out a breath. "Okay, so let's say this bond is real. What happens next? Do we just pretend nothing's different?" Veyna didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "What do you believe should happen?" Ethan let out a slow chuckle. "Lady, I don't even know what just happened. I'm still trying to process the fact that touching you felt like sticking my fingers in an electrical socket and having my brain rewired at the same time." Veyna tilted her head slightly, as if cataloging his reaction. "You do not appear distressed," he snorted. "That's because I have no idea how I'm supposed to feel about this." He shook his head. "But I do know one thing." She watched him intently. "What is that?" Ethan met her gaze, something in his chest tightening. "You felt it too." A beat of silence. Then, so quiet he almost missed it, she exhaled. "Yes." The air between them felt suddenly charged, like something had shifted, something they couldn't ignore. Ethan swallowed. "So what do we do about it?" Veyna didn't look away. "We find out what this means." Ethan smirked. Together, she hesitated. Then finally, "Yes." And just like that, Ethan knew. There was no going back. The days that followed were filled with tension. Veyna and Ethan both seemed to be walking on the edge of something unspoken, something too volatile to name. They hadn't talked about the bond directly since that last examination, but it was always there, hovering between them, a presence neither could ignore. Veyna remained as efficient as ever in her duties, scanning, analyzing, and running tests, but Ethan could see the way she watched him sometimes, her gaze sharp, calculating. He wasn't sure if it was just her usual clinical nature or if something more was at play. It wasn't just her. Ethan found himself doing the same thing, studying her when she wasn't looking, wondering what this all meant. The connection was growing more apparent by the day, each touch, each word, each shared glance more loaded than the last. At times, he swore he could feel her thoughts brushing against his own like a subtle echo. When she was close, his pulse would pick up, not out of fear or nervousness, but something else, something he couldn't quite define. Today, though, something was different. Ethan stood in the med bay, his arms crossed as he watched Veyna from across the room. She was working on a data console, her brow furrowed as she scanned readings from his implant, her hands quick and practiced. But her focus was divided, her movements just a fraction less fluid than usual. It had been a few days since their last close encounter, since the bond had deepened. He wasn't sure if it was the bond itself or something else, but every time they were near each other now, the air felt thick, almost suffocating. "Hey," Ethan called out, leaning against the doorway. "You need a hand with that." Veyna didn't look up immediately, her fingers flying over the console. "I am fine." Ethan raised an eyebrow. Sure." She glanced up then, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his breath catch. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't like before. It wasn't the usual back-and-forth banter. There was something more in the way she looked at him, a flicker of something, vulnerability. Maybe. You're distracted, Ethan said, pushing off the door frame and stepping closer. Not like you. Veyna straightened, pulling her focus back to the screen in front of her. I am not distracted, Ethan smirked, crossing his arms. Okay then, what's on your mind? Veyna hesitated, her fingers hovering over the console's surface. Then she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What if the bond is not just a temporary anomaly? The question hung in the air, and Ethan felt his heart rate quicken. He stepped closer, watching her carefully. What are you saying? She turned toward him fully now, her expression unreadable. What if it is something permanent? What if it is real? Ethan's stomach churned. We've already established it's real, Veyna, her gaze locked with his. You misunderstand. Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet urgency in her tone. I mean, what if this is something neither of us can control? Ethan swallowed, the gravity of her words sinking in. You're saying we're stuck with it. Her eyes softened just slightly, but it was enough to make him stop in his tracks. We may not be able to undo it, she murmured. Whatever this bond is, it may be beyond our understanding. Ethan looked down for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle. Could they really not control this? Could something as intangible as a connection be so powerful that it had the potential to reshape everything they knew? He wasn't sure what scared him more, the fact that it was real, or that he wasn't entirely sure he wanted it to end. I don't know about you, but I don't like the idea of not having a choice, he said, his voice rough. But if it's real, we'll deal with it. Veyna's expression softened. I do not wish to cause you distress, Ethan. He shook his head, meeting her gaze. I'm not distressed. His lips curved into a wry smile. I'm just trying to keep up. For a moment they stood there, caught in the tension between them. The air was thick with words unsaid, emotions unspoken. Finally, Veyna took a step closer, her voice low. We will proceed cautiously then, but I am not afraid of what is happening. Ethan's heart skipped a beat at the sincerity in her voice. She wasn't just speaking to him as a patient or a subject. There was something more in her words. Neither am I, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the way his pulse was racing. Veyna's eyes softened, and for the first time there was no barrier between them. No walls, no defenses, just two people caught in the middle of something neither could explain. And in that moment, as their gazes held, the tension broke. The bond between them didn't feel like a chain. It felt like a bridge, fragile but real, connecting them in ways that neither could fully comprehend. But maybe that was okay. Maybe it was enough just to feel. Ethan's mind spun as the days passed, his thoughts constantly returning to Veyna. The bond was undeniable now. Every time she was near, every time their eyes met, something shifted inside him, an unsettling mix of anticipation and connection. He couldn't get her out of his head, and he could tell she was struggling with the same thing, though she didn't admit it. They kept working, their professional distance still in place, but the tension between them was palpable. It was like walking a tightrope. One wrong move, one word too many, and everything could unravel. He couldn't stop wondering what it would mean for them, this connection. What if it changed everything? What if the bond was a curse, a tether they couldn't escape? Or worse, what if they didn't want to escape it? That night, after another long shift, Ethan found himself waiting outside Veyna's quarters. He hadn't planned to go to her. He hadn't planned anything. But somehow he found his feet carrying him there, the need to talk to her more pressing than anything else. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and there she stood, her silhouette framed by the soft light from within. Her eyes met his, guarded but not entirely distant. What is it? She asked, her tone quiet but sharp. Ethan hesitated, his heart thudding in his chest. There was so much he wanted to say, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he took a step forward, crossing the threshold into her space. I need to know what this is, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. What's happening between us? Veyna didn't step back. Instead, she regarded him for a moment, as if weighing the depth of his question. She took a slow breath, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. "I do not have the answers," she said finally. "But I feel it too, Ethan. Whatever this is, it's unlike anything I've ever experienced." Her words struck him in a way he hadn't expected, and the vulnerability in her voice sent a jolt through him. She was admitting it. She didn't understand it either. Ethan stepped closer, his pulse quickening. "I don't think we can just ignore this, Veyna. I mean, it's not exactly something you can just sweep under the rug, right?" Veyna's gaze softened, and for a brief moment she looked almost uncertain. "No, I suppose not." He couldn't resist it anymore. He reached out, gently brushing her arm with his fingertips. The touch was electric, a rush of heat surging between them. He saw the way her breath hitched, the way her pupils dilated as if she was struggling to keep herself composed. He didn't want to pull away. He didn't want to fight the pull between them, but he needed to know if it was just the bond, or if it was something more. "You feel it too," he whispered. "This, whatever it is." Veyna's gaze dropped to where his fingers lingered on her skin and her breath caught. For a moment she didn't speak, as if she was trying to find the words. Then she nodded, her voice barely audible. Yes. The word was simple, but it held so much weight. She didn't need to say anything more, he knew. She felt it too, and that made everything more complicated than it already was. He closed the distance between them, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. The tension between them flared, but this time it didn't feel like something to be avoided. It felt like something to be embraced. "Then what do we do?" he asked softly, his lips dangerously close to hers. Veyna closed her eyes for a moment, taking a breath as if steadying herself. When she opened them again, her gaze met his with a clarity that sent a shiver down his spine. "We explore it," she said quietly. Her words were the final thread that unraveled the rest of his restraint. With a low exhale, he closed the gap between them, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was both tender and desperate, like they were both trying to make sense of something they couldn't fully explain. The kiss deepened quickly, the bond between them sparking and intensifying with each touch. Ethan's hands found her waist, pulling her closer, the heat of her body overwhelming, intoxicating. Every instinct in him told him to keep going, to feel more, to explore the connection they shared. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the kiss broke and they pulled back, breaths ragged, their bodies still humming with the intensity of the moment. Ethan's heart was racing, his thoughts scattered. What does this mean?" Veyna didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached up, her hand gently cupping his cheek. Her touch was soft, but there was something incredibly grounding in it. "I do not know," she murmured, "but we will figure it out together." And in that moment, despite the uncertainty swirling around them, Ethan felt a surge of warmth in his chest. Whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. No matter the cost. There was a lot left to figure out, but for the first time, Ethan wasn't afraid of the unknown. Not with her by his side. The next few days passed in a blur. The connection between Ethan and Veyna had shifted from something uncertain and confusing to something undeniable, something neither could ignore. Their work together had become a strange mix of professionalism and intimacy, as if every word, every gesture carried the weight of their growing bond. They spoke less now, but the silences between them felt different, comfortable, laden with meaning. There was an unspoken agreement between them. They didn't have to rush into anything. They'd let whatever this was unfold in its own time, at its own pace. But there was also an undeniable pull, one neither of them could resist for long. It was in the quiet moments when their hands brushed or their eyes met across a crowded room, in the small smiles they shared when no one was looking, in the way they found each other's company more than comforting, how their proximity became a source of grounding, a steady reassurance. One evening, after another long day of work, Veyna invited Ethan to her quarters again. He wasn't sure if it was her way of breaking the silence or if she simply wanted him there. Whatever the reason, he didn't question it. When he arrived, the atmosphere felt different, lighter, almost as if the weight of the bond was no longer something heavy hanging between them, but something they had finally accepted. She was sitting by a small desk, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating her features, but there was an openness in her expression now, something that hadn't been there before. "Sit," she said, her voice gentle. Ethan did as she asked, settling into the chair beside her. The silence stretched between them, but it was comfortable, no longer strained. Veyna turned to face him, her eyes searching his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. "Ethan," she paused as if gathering her thoughts, "I want you to understand something." Ethan met her gaze, his curiosity piqued. "What?" "I know we've been dancing around this, whatever it is between us," she said softly. "And I know it's complicated. I know it doesn't make sense, but I want to be honest with you." Her words hit him harder than he expected. His chest tightened, a mix of anticipation and vulnerability settling in. "You're being honest now," he replied, his voice low. Veyna smiled, a faint, wistful expression on her face. "Yes, but this is different. I want you to know that no matter what happens between us, I will not regret this. I do not regret what we have discovered." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan could feel the weight of them, but it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like freedom, like a weight lifted from his chest. "I don't regret it either," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions bubbling up inside him. "I just don't want this to be a mistake." Veyna's expression softened. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his. "This is not a mistake. We are not mistakes." The sincerity in her voice calmed him, grounding him in a way nothing else could. He knew deep down that whatever happened next, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. They sat there for a long time, hands intertwined, the bond between them steady and constant. The future was still uncertain, still unclear. But as they sat together in the quiet of the room, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever challenges awaited them, whatever obstacles lay ahead, they would face them together. And that was enough. Ethan leaned in then, pressing his forehead to hers, his breath mingling with hers in the stillness of the room. "We'll figure it out," he whispered. Veyna's eyes closed, her hand gently squeezing his. "Yes, we will." The words felt like a promise, a shared understanding that they had already crossed a threshold, one they couldn't unstep. But it was a promise that didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a beginning. The end of one chapter and the start of a new one, together. Want more thrilling adventures like this? Don't miss out. Subscribe now and join us for brand new stories every day. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next twist in the tale. We've got so much more to share.